Hello everyone and welcome to week 7 of game asset creation. This week we will be looking at physically based rendering. So to cut a long story short, this is basically how the materials are set up, either in Unreal or Blender or whatever animation or game-based software that you're using. So yes, this week is on materials and how the various textures influence the different parts of the materials and the general sort of method behind it all. So to recap the game asset creation pipeline, the first step is concept art. We haven't been looking at actually generating your own concept art. It's not part of the scope of this course. We're mostly following on the steps that come after that, which is the high poly modeling, followed by the low poly, the UV unwrapping, baking and texturing, which we'll be continuing to look at this week, and getting those files all together in the engine. That is also part of this week. What we'll be looking at is how all the textures tie together, how to set up materials in general, and how all that relates to assignment 2. So just to go back to the concept art for now, while we won't be, like I said, generating any of our own concept art as part of this course, for assignment 2, we do start off with what is referred to as a mood board. So at the start of a process, let's say you're working on a character, but this is also the same for the various scenes and props and any sort of asset that would go into a game. There will be a mix of concept art, so particularly if it's a fictional object that doesn't really exist in the real world. A concept artist will do a series of 2D paintings and illustrations. Concept sculpts in ZBrush are becoming far more common. So it may be that the asset starts as a conceptual sculpt and that one file will get iterated on until it ends up in the actual game. Reference, so taking any sort of material reference, so similar types of metals or leathers or wood, skin, actors' faces, anything from the real world that is, a photograph that you can use to take, I need this bit from here, and the material from that, and the shape of this. Mood board, which we're about to have a look at in the video, is a combination of those two. So it's quite common for there to be not enough time for concept artists to do a concept for absolutely every item in a game. That depends entirely on the game and the budget and all that sort of thing. If it's an open world game, they might get to do concepts for, this is the lead set of characters, this is one of each of the, bad guys or NPCs, and then it's up to the modelers and texturers to make variations on those. So, we've got concept art for one of the merchants, but being an open world game, you're going to buy various items and stuff from merchants in all the different locations. So we'll need you to make 7 different variations on that because we've got 7 different areas that the character will go to. So as part of that, this is a real example of a mood board, which we covered in person in the practical when explaining assignment 2. So I won't spend too much longer on it, but yes, just to recap, the mood board that you'll need for assignment 2 is this kind of thing. So in the center here, we've got the detailed character concept art of, this is this particular orc assassin. If you've played the Shadow of Mordor or Shadow of War games, you'll notice that each type of character has at least dozens of different variations on all the different pieces. So, there would be ones that had like 5 different variations of the shoulder pad, 8 different variations of weapons or whatever. Just making up these numbers as examples for now. But so we've got the one main concept art to get the direction of where this is going. We've got some reference images up the top here from the films. Because obviously, the game is designed to tie in with the film franchise, because that's what most people have seen as far as getting into Lord of the Rings. These masks here are not actually what's on the character. However, the way that the leather is put together, the different stitching, this sort of there's some cloth folds going on, but mostly it's fairly tightly pulled. That is what you're getting from these images here. So they're not recreating those masks on that character, but they are taking the material qualities and various elements of how it is actually made and stitched together. Similarly, we've got the leathers for the bike rider here. This orc is not going to get on a motorcycle, even though that would look pretty cool. It's more about the leather and how that would sit on that part of the body. So the ankle having a lot of range of movement. Every time you move, walk, run, your ankle is going to bend, so the cloth is going to bunch up and fold a lot on those areas. So again, they're not making a bike rider, but this is leather that will appear on the character in a similar sort of place. They need to know how it would fold in the real world, and that helps the modeler and the texture artist when they're putting this together on the fictional character. And then, more images of the same sort of scenario where this image would be taking the material, so how reflective it is. They've got a bit of shine on the shoulder. It's giving a reflection over the whole surface, but it's not a mirror reflection by any means. There's just enough of a hint of light over the top of that leather, and also how it sits on the character. And then the body type of the character. They're going to be the thinner, wiry, scrappy sort of character. This type of reference image just helps whoever's sculpting the actual body that will show underneath the various clothing elements what type of physical character they're going after. And then, again, some more references of buckles and chainmail, which are a staple on all the various orcs that you see in that game and the films. So yes, for assignment 2, if you have any further questions on the mood board and what sort of things you should include, for this assignment you're not actually going to have any concept art really, unless you've picked an object from a film or game and you happen to be able to find the original concept art online. So if you were looking, for example, for, I've mentioned the Assassin's Creed games before, they quite frequently post a lot of their art once the videos are once the games are live. So that may make it easier for you. It's not necessarily required. Most of our concept and mood board for assignment 2 is going to be screenshots from the game of the item that you're intending to make, or still screenshots from the film if you've got the ability to do that. If the item happens to be in the trailer, you could probably go on YouTube, pause the trailer, take a screen capture of that as a way to get that into your mood board, and then collecting a range of similar images that show off objects that are made in a similar way. So does it have the same sort of stitching on the material? Does it reflect the same sort of way because it's, both items are made out of wood? Does it have a similar level of detail in like the carving, or is it all Celtic patterning or something? That kind of reference then put together in one sheet like we were looking at, and that's basically the starting point for your mood board. So why are we taking a look at concept art and reference in week 7? Very good question. Mostly up to this point, we've been looking at the sort of technical aspects of how to do things. So the basics of how to make a model, the basics of how to keep that model low poly, the basics of how to sort of get that high poly model and start working in smoother surfaces and crisper edges. The basics of how to, we did dip into this a bit more during the texture week, of trying to get things to look like specifically wood or metal. But where this becomes particularly relevant for the physically based rendering is that physically based rendering obviously is based on how materials behave in the real physical world. So it's thank you to Tom from last year. I'm using his slides as the basis for this week's lecture because they were quite well put together. A texturing, lighting, and shading workflow that, when followed correctly, allows CG materials to behave like their real-world counterparts. So Unreal under the hood, or Blender or any other piece of software, which is now most of them that support this type of rendering. The way the materials are set up and the way the lighting behaves and the way the light sort of bounces around, or is given the effect to bounce off one surface and hit another, is designed to mimic how light behaves in the real world. So if you think of very early computer graphics, so like the first Toy Story film, most of Toy Story was plastic characters. And, that was obviously the story behind it. It was focusing around these plastic toys and what they sort of get up to when the people aren't around. There was a very, very good reason why Toy Story focused on plastic characters for the first fully computer animated feature film, is that plastics were about the only thing computers could do somewhat realistically at that point. You had your diffuse part of a material, so the color, and then you could add a specular on top of that, which is sort of the bright highlight that sort of fake a little bit of a reflection. And to a large extent, that was about all that computers could do. So early CG, if you go back and look at it now, like older films or older special effects, a lot of characters, backgrounds, anything that was added sort of digitally often comes off as having a bit of a plastic look to it, because that's pretty much all rendering engines could do. As computer graphics developed, the rendering techniques got more and more advanced. Computers got faster and faster to be able to handle these, whether it's a fake approximation like it is in the video game, or whether it's a more accurate rendering like Blender's Cycles renderer. So because of the technology improving and because of the hardware getting better to actually display it, where we're at now is this physically based rendering. So if we follow this workflow that we're looking at now, it'll give us predictable, reproducible results. And it can remove a lot of the trial and error and guesswork. It doesn't remove all of it though, because obviously what really matters at the end of the day is the actual look of the game. So if you've gone through and you've done all the research on, this is this level of reflectivity, this material is always this particular level of, it's 0.2 or 20% glossy. You can put in all those numbers, but the end result of this is how it looks in the game when everything's running, that's the most important thing. So it can remove a lot of that trial and error and get you to a nice looking result quicker. But I've found that, while we're working with Unreal Engine 4, the Unity game engine, I don't know if anyone's used Unity for their other assignments. Unity's lighting, or at least in the versions of Unity that I used, seem to need a lot more nudging and tweaking and, probably doubling some of the values from what they should have been to at least kind of look right, just because the way the lighting behaved and the way that the lighting behaves in the real world, it wasn't as robust as, say, Unreal's lighting engine. That's probably changed a bit now. It's been a while since I've used Unity, but just thought I'd bring that up. So, PBR, physically based rendering materials, and what does that actually look like for this course and for assignment 2? Surprise, surprise, we will need a color texture, which is often referred to as an albedo or a diffuse texture. So if you see the words color, albedo, diffuse on a texture map, it all effectively means the same thing. So that is the basic color of the object. Surprise. What I'll get into a little more in a second is that the color map should have certain things in it and should leave other details off. The metallic map, most often black and white map. For the example, in week 1, I basically just loaded up Unreal, set that metallic value to 1, and then only tweaked the roughness. So this wasn't strictly accurate, but sort of wait till now to split those two up a bit more and explain them. Within Blender and Blender's rendering engine, the two sort of main materials that you'd combine, or material nodes even, would be a diffuse node and a glossy node. The glossy node being, effectively a mix of what's referred to here as the metallic and roughness. So within Blender, if you have a glossy material with a roughness of 0, it's sort of 100% chrome mirror finish. If you have a glossy material with a roughness of 1, then it effectively becomes back to a diffuse material. I'll explain this a bit more in a second, but the sort of the difference between the two is metallic refers to items that are actually metal, and what the difference there is that other materials can also have a glossy sort of surface to them, like your plastics, but that comes through as being a combination of the metallic and a roughness map. But we'll get to that a bit more in a second. So within physically based rendering, we take one material and combine a whole lot of different textures. These textures help drive that material to give a result in Unreal or Blender, etc., Maya, to represent a material as it would be in the real world. So at the moment we've got sort of the leather backing on what might be a sofa or something. So it's a combination of the color or diffuse map, the ambient occlusion map, the normal map, and a roughness map on the side there. So again, what I was saying about the color / albedo / diffuse map. It is the perceived overall color of a surface. What that means is if you were to take a photo of an object and slap that on as the texture, that photo, for the most part, is going to have lighting in it as part of the photo because, the object has lighting in the real world. So when you are creating your color map, broadly speaking, you want to remove as much shadow detail or lighting information out of that. So if you've taken a photo of, say, a little plastic bottle, and there's like the little bright highlight where the sort of the light is reflecting on the side, you would want to remove as many of those bright highlights or lighten up the shadows in the image texture so that you're just left with the color. Values for this map can be pulled out of the real world. So again, if you're using photo reference, there are ways of taking photos so that you can minimize how much lighting and shadow and reflectivity there is in there. Obviously, you want no fine detail shadows, no widespread shadows, and separating out the ambient occlusion. So in terms of the no fine shadows and no widespread shadows, if you're taking reference photos of an object to use as the base for your texture, the best thing you can do for it is to take the photo, say, outside on an overcast day. So in terms of the real world, that's probably going to be the closest you'll get to having a evenly lit object with minimum reflections, because there's still light coming through from the sun, but there is no direct bright highlight of the sunlight. The shadows are all going to be softer and broader, just because of the way light works on an overcast day, and that will result in less work in Photoshop to sort of reverse engineer that back into the color textures that you need. With the ambient occlusion, applying it as a separate texture and applying it at the shader level. So we did do this in week 4 for the texturing, but again, just to avoid a sort of do as I say but not as I do sort of scenario, we also used the ambient occlusion as part of our color map in that week to start defining built up grunge and dirt in the sort of recessed areas of the object. So strictly speaking, if you are going to use a realistic lighting engine like Unreal, you don't want ambient occlusion just baked into the texture. The way that used to be common is because lighting wasn't as accurate in games as it is today. So putting that in the color map was a way of just cheating some information into the lighting. These days, you've got the two separate slots for the two separate maps, and it is a good guideline to have the color map and the ambient occlusion separately. However, due to the nature of the ambient occlusion map being darker things built up in the corners, if you were to tweak the colors of that and sort of start painting bits out of it, it can be a good starting point for dirt and grime and things that are worn down. So again, guidelines, but whatever gets you the result that you need at the end, and whatever works within the broader pipeline of that game's art assets. So the color map having no specular. Again, specular is sort of the term for what used to be, if we go back to the Toy Story image, the specular is the little bright white highlight that indicates a reflection. It's often just the top highlight on an object. It's not usually the actual reflection that you would see in metal, because specular by its nature was a way of cheating some of that back before computers were advanced enough to give accurate reflections for that. All of this is going to be handled using our metal and our rough textures and the material settings in Unreal. So if there are any highlights or little sheens in the color map, paint those out in Photoshop first. Neutral lighting, as I mentioned, best bet is to take photos or reference on an overcast day outside, and generally color maps end up looking very, very flat. So if we look at this example here with just the base color, again, there's some of the dirt and grime and grunge on various keys because of the keyboard. But again, to just make reference of the history of the object, it looks like whoever did this texture was referencing someone who puts their coffee cup on the number pad. Don't know how that wasn't frequently giving them issues with their machine, but yeah, so there is wear and tear and detail in this color map and on the keys and on the different colors being different shades. But if you were to sort of do the squint test and just look at this object, it is rather flat. There's not a whole lot of value or brightness change going on. So if we were to add the other textures back onto this, ambient occlusion is not really doing a whole lot in this one, but we can see with the actual lighting applied and the normal maps giving a sort of a slightly rounder edge to all of the keys, the curve on the front, the different maps combined are sort of what bring this alive. So the color map, yeah, very, very flat sort of look to it, but it's the other maps that give the sort of life to the surface of that object, generally speaking. So, color map, one single color. It's pretty unusual in a game or any sort of animation for the color map to just be one completely flat color. I did notice that for the majority of Assignment 1 submissions, this is what the color maps looked like. There are scenarios where this does happen, so it's, it's not completely out of the ordinary, but there is usually at least some detail in that color map, whether it's a smudge, a thumbprint, or something to hint that it's not all uniformly one color, because that rarely happens in real life, that it's actually the one color and it's perfectly clean. This, of course, can be different if it's a more stylized object. So, the texture on Mario's hat might actually be all 100% the same red, with the only change being the white for the logo behind the M. But if we were to take this example of just the one flat color as a color map and add just the normals to it, we can see that the normal map is doing the bulk of the heavy lifting for making this look realistic. There is some reflectivity going on. We can see that there are, brighter sort of highlights, particularly on this corner here. There are indents to the model, and the normal map has shown like a little bit of wear here, where this screw sort of continually come in and out. Well, I mean, that would be the end of the screw there, but there has been a little bit of damage, and there's just some very, very slight wear to the surface overall, which adds to that realism. This is also a good example of some of the do's of a normal map as opposed to the don'ts. if we just go back a step, the model here, all the silhouette is defined by the actual polygons themselves, so the physical outline of that object, and the normals are more the finer surface details. So having these ridges in the side here, you could model those in, but it would be more effective to do those with the normal map. But, you know, if you were to try and do too much of a shape change and have that only affected with the normal map, it just wouldn't look right, because as soon as you rotate the model, you need to be able to see that change in shape for the much larger forms. Metal or metallic map. So again, not to repeat myself too much, but it defines which parts of the object are metal and which aren't. In Unreal, we chuck in a value of 100% white, everything else is black. Everything else includes obviously wood, fabric, plastics, literally anything that isn't a metal. There again, there's sort of the edge cases as to whether it's a solid or whether you can use any gradients. To keep things simpler, if you had everything that is metal as solid white and everything that's not as solid black, that's going to keep things less confusing. Where that starts to get a little fuzzy is, say, metallic paint. So, you know, car paint or things like that. It's paint, which is an insulator, so it's non-metallic, but it has flecks of metal in it. So it has a bit of both. So there are times where you may have a slight sort of a gradient, but for assignment 2, and just to keep things straightforward, if the metal value was a map that is either 1 or 100% white for metal and 0 or 100% black for everything else, that's fine. Insulators. So I used this term just before. Insulator is anything that's not a metal. Where this comes into play for us is things like the plastics. So that's where we have metal at 100% reflectivity. All of that like the material is only made up of the reflective or glossy sort of component. There is no diffuse component on metal, really. However, if we were to get a very, very shiny plastic, this is a mix of, you know, the diffuse color of the plastic underneath and then the reflective component on top of that. So red metal, for example, will always reflect, you know, a red tinted reflection. Where you might have red plastic, the plastic itself underneath might be red, but the reflection might take on the colors of the world around it. So, and then, you know, any other material is also a sort of a mix of that with the insulator, where wood is not that reflective overall, so most of the color that it's getting as an object is defined by the diffuse, and then there might be a little bit of highlight here and there, but it would be a very, very rough reflection, so you know, you can't see the rest of the scene being reflected on it. Example of a metal map. So in this case, there is a slight bit of grey here and there, but it's for the most part just black and white. So as I was just sort of mentioning, for insulator, there is the diffuse color. So for the example of the plastic bottle, the diffuse will be defining the base color, and any sort of glossy reflection on top of that, if it's a, you know, plastic or polished item, you know, polished wood would have some reflection of the scene around it. That reflection will also take on colors of the scene around it. But for metals, the diffuse defines the intensity, so how bright the metal is, and it defines the overall colors of the reflections. Clearly, if you've got like a chrome or an actual mirror, there's not going to be any color in that. It's just going to be bright white. So that doesn't tint the reflections, and then you get your accurate reflection in a mirror or a chrome or that sort of thing. But if you were to, again, define that as a red piece of metal, that color would be multiplied over the rest of the colors that are getting reflected in it. Remember to reference known values for the metal diffuse map or reflectance. I'll get to a chart in a second, but there are a whole lot of values out there for computer graphics artists and obviously for game asset artists for the different values in the real world of this type of metal reflects this much light and it is this glossy sort of thing. These values are also very handy for liquids and surfaces like glass as for the index of refraction or IOR values. Those are pretty common to find. Very, very detailed sort of results of those online as well. The roughness map. So defines the microsurface imperfections or diffuse. I mean, if we were to think of a piece of wood, it was a polished piece of wood that is going to have a nice sort of sheen to it. It's not going to reflect as much as a mirror, but you know, you will be able to see the light reflected on it and a bit of a pattern of the scene sort of around it reflected on its surface. If that surface was to be roughed up with a piece of sandpaper, or you know, it's a bit of tree bark that was rough to start with, that roughness value is going to be quite high because the very, very fine surface detail of that object would be roughed up, whether it's, you know, from the sanding or it was rough to start with, and that won't reflect nearly as much of the, like, it'll reflect light, but it won't have any sort of reflection as we know from a mirror or a polished surface. So, you know, roughness is how polished is that object, and how much of a sheen are we getting on the top of that. Black will give us a roughness of 0. So anything that's 0% rough is another way of saying 100% glossy. So that's where we get our mirrors. And if it is a roughness of white, or 100% or 1.0, whatever value you're sort of plugging in there, that will give us a completely diffuse surface or a very rough surface, or, you know, to bring back to that example, that would be where your wood that's been roughed up with the sandpaper would be a white roughness of, you know, completely diffuse. Example of the roughness map there. It's still a grayscale map, but there's much more gradient going on. Like, none of it is 100% black, and there are very few parts of that item that are 100% white, which we can see a little bit of up here, but for the most part it's a mix between the two. Roughness can be a time-consuming map. When we did the texturing example in the practical, that was the one that I had the sort of most trial and error on, going back and forward to Unreal. Can be handy to have Photoshop open and Unreal open and just tweak a bit, re-import, tweak a bit, re-import. You can use artistic license to sort of figure out this is what looks the best, but this is definitely one of those maps where using reference, so back to our mood board, that's where this really starts to come into play. So having those images up on, you know, a second monitor if you happen to have one, or, you know, if you do a printout or just alt-tabbing between the two, constantly checking back, okay, so I'm making a fictional item, but I've got my real-world reference of, like, the motorcyclist having sort of the leather protective parts on the legs. How reflective or how rough is that leather? How much light is it sort of shining on the top of the highlights? And this is where you would use that going back and forward in and out of Unreal, tweaking the values to make it look like it does on that mood board. So you may find some values for this online, but the roughness map is much more of a getting a feel for the different materials and tweaking until they look accurate like the real world references. So, ambient occlusion. We've covered this before. Ambient occlusion is the sort of surface shadowing on an object. So, to use the example of someone walking down a footpath again, the overall main shadow and highlights would be from the sun if they're outside walking down the street. The ambient occlusion would be sort of the surface shadows or contact shadows, so much more, you know, if they're wearing a shirt, the sleeve would be casting a little bit of shadow on the edge of the arm. Anywhere one object sort of slightly overlaps another, or a hat or different layers of clothing, there's going to be a hint of shadow where one object starts to cover another. This is where your ambient occlusion map comes in. Fortunately, these are very easy to bake these days. You can bake ambient occlusion from a high-res model to a low-res one, or you can actually just take the low-res mesh and bake ambient occlusion straight out. You will get a much more accurate ambient occlusion map by doing a high-res mesh first, and then baking that to the low-res. This will be required for assignment 2. We've covered it a bit already, and we'll be sure to cover it more before that assignment is due. Reference charts. So this is an example of a reference chart. These are very easy to find online. This is where we're getting our values for our color maps. Again, this is up to interpretation of whatever looks right in the final game with the lighting all applied, but these can provide you your accurate starting range for, if you had to recreate rubber, you can see that that's a particular color value. Gold and brass, you can see that these aren't nearly as saturated as you think they might be. That's just because of the way the reflection sort of works on highly polished metals. If you get the albedo or color of that right, and then the glossiness of that right, you will then get the more saturated look of the metal overall once it's in the actual scene. Moving right along, so marmoset, as in marmoset tool bag, can be a very useful tool for artists putting assets together. They have a range of preset materials, Quixel mega scans. So again, this is scans as in scanning in photogrammetry, which we looked at a bit last week. So again, taking real world reference, breaking it down into presets that can be used by artists, that we can use as a starting point at least for the various common sort of materials that we'd find. And I say starting point because, if you use the one preset for concrete, and that's the only preset you'll ever need, and your game is set in like New York or something, suddenly everything's going to look very, very identical because, concrete has a basic similarity to other concrete, but you're going to need to have different variations of it. Is that concrete polished? Is it, got a darker material on it? Is it partially painted? Has it been mixed to a certain ratio with another material to give your scene a much more varied look? Similarly with brick, rock, dirt, all that, it's definitely not one type of dirt and that's it. You can use this as a starting point to get in the right area, and then, so, if it was the Australian outback, that would obviously be a lot more red content in the albedo. So this chart is a luminosity chart. This chart is from a value of 0 being black to 255 being white. So these charts are often in different scales. Sometimes they're between 0 and 1. That is often how materials are done within Blender. Everything has a maximum value of 1, because if it's going higher than 1, it's reflecting more light than is being shown onto it, which makes it non-realistic. Conservation of energy is the sort of more technical way of doing that, but basically for physical-based materials, you don't want more light being reflected off the object than is being cast onto it. For the most part, that's something that Unreal will take care of for you. The short version is don't use add shaders, always use mix shaders. So that will ensure that your materials look right in the, they don't just look right under one lighting condition, they'll look right in any lighting that you put under them. So with this chart, snow being the most reflective here, it's still not 100% white, and coal being the darkest one, it's still not 100% black. So it's very rare that with the brightness of a material that it'll be 100% one or the other, especially in the color map. Similarly, this is an example of a roughness chart, or a chart of how glossy various materials are. So again, we've got our metallic for items that are made of metal, and our non-metallic for items on this end might be like your plastics, so it's still reflective, but the diffuse color is doing most of the work for you. Whereas with a metallic, the entire color is based on the reflection. We can also see with a metallic and a non-metallic sliders, as they both get further to the roughness value of 1. This non-metallic example has got a darker sort of base color to it, but they effectively end up having the same roughness at that side and look like they're kind of made of the same material. It's just this one's a darker shade to start with. So just a couple of things to wrap up with for this week. A lot of what we've been talking about is for physically based materials and giving a certain level of realism. Obviously, this applies mostly to games of a realistic visual nature. So if you're trying to make things look like they do in real life. However, a lot of games are stylized. So depending on the art style might also depend on how many of these textures are actually used in the final engine. If a game is ending up on mobile, perhaps it only uses the color texture and there's no lighting at all. This helps it run faster, and things like the ambient occlusion might be baked into the color texture to give shapes some sort of definition. Or partway between those two might be something like Mario Odyssey, where it is obviously a very stylized game. However, within that stylized look, there are still a lot of the same sort of maps going on. So there is ambient occlusion, which is helping us give a bit of this shadow here. There is the roughness values, which is defining, this red paint on the top here is mostly the one red color value. We're getting a bit of a white sort of highlight to that. The metallic map, where some of the paint has chipped off, just to give a bit of variation in that shape. And, obviously these look very computer graphics, but just a little bit of realism here and there to give a bit of a history to the surface of that object, but nothing too dramatic because overall the model is quite clean. There's very, very glossy reflection on the front of this headlamp here. So yeah, even though it's a very stylized cartoon look, those same maps can be used in this type of an art style to help get things across. Also, I've put a link in the Learn Online page for this week to the GDC talk where they were talking about developing the assets, materials, and lighting for Metal Gear Solid 5. This is not required viewing, but it is recommended viewing. I found this to be a very informative talk when I watched it originally. The thing that I'm sort of referencing here specifically is to help with the physically based rendering and getting all the materials to be consistent within this game. Consistent meaning, if they put this rubber or this metal or whatever surface it was in one lighting condition, or then they changed the lighting condition to nighttime outdoors, or they changed it to daytime indoors by a window, the materials would behave accurately as you would expect them to in each of those lighting conditions and look consistent across all the objects. How they did this, and they go into it in more detail in the talk, is to take their actual conference room at Konami as a reference point. So they built as accurate a version of the conference room in 3D as possible, got all the materials and the lighting values as accurate as possible for the chairs, walls, very uniformly coloured room, not a whole lot of reflected lighting coming off, there's no bright red walls or anything. They accurately measured the lighting values within the room, and so because they were confident in how accurate this conference room scene was, they were able to put in every art asset in the game into this conference room, and if it looked right there, they were confident that it could look right in any scenario in that game. I won't drag on too much about that example because they go into it in much better detail in that video. But yes, it was definitely a way of them saying, here is our benchmark scene. Anything that works in this scene will work for the rest of the game. So that's all for this week. For the practical, we'll be looking at tying some of these examples together and some of the texture work that is required to get the most out of physically based rendering. Thank you.